As the war in Ukraine continues, Ukraine has been trying to get enough weapons and equipment to defend itself. Meanwhile, Russia has not only increased its military activities around the world, but has also significantly ramped up its production of military supplies. Russia's significant investment in its military has surprised the US and European countries, as they did not expect Russia to sustain a long-term war, especially given their own efforts to support Ukraine by funding the conflict and supplying advanced weapons. However, Russia has a habit of surprising the US and its Western counterparts with bold moves. For instance, after World War II, Germany was divided into 4 zones, controlled by the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, though located in the Soviet zone, was also divided, with the western part controlled by the Allies, and the eastern part by the Soviets. Initially united against a common enemy, the Allies and the Soviet Union soon diverged in their goals for Germany, and tensions escalated. The Soviets, led by Stalin, wanted to punish Germany economically, while the Allies aimed to rebuild its economy to prevent the spread of communism from Eastern Europe. In 1948, the Soviets imposed the Berlin blockade, cutting off all roads, trains, and canals to West Berlin to stop the US, Britain, and France from bringing supplies, aiming to force them out of the city. In response, the Allies launched the Berlin Airlift, supplying West Berlin with food and fuel by air for almost a year, until the Soviets lifted the blockade in 1949. In the Korean War of 1950, North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea to unify the peninsula under communist control. The US led a United Nations coalition to defend South Korea, resulting in a 3-year conflict that ended in a stalemate, leaving the Korean peninsula divided. And now, North Korea occasionally pops up to remind us they're still around, with their we might nuke you routine, like a really aggressive neighbor who just can't let go of old grudges. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and the Soviet Union nearly initiated a nuclear war. This came after the US's failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's Cuban government in 1961. And Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's secret agreement with Castro to station nuclear missiles in Cuba as a deterrent against future US attacks. From the Cold War to today's Russia-Ukraine conflict, Kremlin knows how to make Western countries worry by showing off its power. Just a few days ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a meeting with senior editors of international news agencies, said the West was wrong to think Russia would never use nuclear weapons. He warned that Russia's nuclear doctrine allowed the use of such weapons. He also said that if NATO allows Ukraine to strike Russia with more powerful weapons, it could lead the West into a war with Russia. And Russia would shoot down those missiles, including US ATACMS and British and French systems, and might place its own long-range missiles near countries helping Ukraine. Moscow has found another way to provoke Washington, by planning to send troops and equipment for military exercises near the US. This involves deploying naval vessels to the Caribbean, potentially making port calls in Cuba and Venezuela. Cuba's Revolutionary Armed Forces Ministry announced that a Russian nuclear-powered submarine, the Kazan, along with 3 other Russian naval vessels, the missile frigate Admiral Gorshkov, the fleet oil tanker Passion, and the rescue tug Nikolai Chika, will visit Havana from June 12 to 17. So this summer, Russia will conduct heightened naval and air activity near the United States. Biden is probably dusting off his old spyglass, squinting through it, and muttering about Russia's multitasking, that is, fighting in Europe and holidaying in the Caribbean. Moscow has massively ramped up its industry. As the conflict evolved throughout 2024, Russia increased its military spending to 1/3 of its budget, or about 7.5% of its GDP. Supply chains have been revamped to secure essential inputs and evade sanctions. Factories making ammunition, vehicles, and equipment are operating 24/7, with mandatory 12-hour shifts and double overtime, and 520,000 new jobs have been created in the military-industrial sector, employing 3.5 million Russians. The IISS says that Russia can keep up its military efforts for a long time. and can quickly boost its military production by ordering more supplies, increasing budgets, and reassigning workers. However, they might struggle to find parts for complex weapons, like missiles, especially if sanctions get stricter. Despite this, they are still making Iskander and Kh-101 missiles. Russia isn't able to make as many new armored vehicles as they need, so they're fixing up old ones instead. According to IASS, Russian factories claim to have delivered 1,500 main battle tanks this year, of which 1,180 to 1,280 have been reactivated from storage. In early 2023, Russia centralized over a dozen plants, including gunpowder factories under Rostec, to ramp up production of artillery shells and military vehicles. The Kazan gunpowder plant hired 500 workers, tripling their salaries to 90,000 rubles, offering night shifts, and exempting them from military service, to attract personnel avoiding frontline duty. Kurgan-Mush-Zavod, which produces the BMP-2 and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, has brought in student and convict labor in order to help the factory meet its deadlines. Also, Iran and North Korea are playing its part, sending weapons to Russia, which makes things harder for Ukraine. And this means that Russia can keep attacking Ukraine with missiles and drones, putting pressure on Ukraine's defenses and trying to weaken their morale. This surge in defense spending has boosted incomes for workers in military industries and soldier families, yet it poses long-term strains on Russia's economy amidst efforts to balance military funding, social needs, and inflation concerns. But this means that Russia can keep fighting in Ukraine for another 2 to 3 years, or even longer, if things keep going the way they are. And one significant reason Moscow could continue the war despite facing increased sanctions is its stash of oil and gas reserves, with a significant portion going to Asia and Europe. Ironically, the EU countries are supplying sophisticated weapons to Ukraine to help it win the war, while simultaneously bolstering the Russian economy by indirectly purchasing billions of dollars worth of Russian oil products, re-exported through Turkey. So, they sanction Russia and then end up financing its war machine through these clever workarounds. It seems this cycle of hypocrisy will just keep going round and round. How China and Russia are encroaching on US power. Russia is like a wounded lion, still powerful but struggling to regain its former strength and influence on the world stage. It views itself as fighting against Western imperium, which it claims humiliated Russia after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, by encroaching on Moscow's sphere of influence, including Ukraine. This feeling of being surrounded by Western influence has fueled its actions, including its involvement not only in physical combat, like the one in Ukraine, but also in non-military strategies and tactics. These methods are designed to influence political decisions, create divisions, and undermine the stability and unity of Western nations. On this path, Russia is not alone. It has its old friend China, which is economically powerful like the US, and also has significant global influence. A small example is Pakistan, which was previously aligned closely with the US, and helped in Afghanistan, now heavily influenced by China, and has become more dependent on Chinese economic and strategic support. It's not just Pakistan. China is steadily expanding its influence in several countries that were previously within the US's sphere of influence, particularly in regions like Africa and the Middle East. Its influence in Europe has also been expanding, although the dynamics are somewhat different compared to Africa or the Middle East. So why is China's influence surging while US influence is decreasing? Despite both facing criticism, China and the US have quite different playbooks for global influence. China uses economic investments and partnerships, usually with fewer political conditions, focusing on economic integration and soft power to expand its reach. In contrast, the US relies on military power and political interventions, often imposing its value. Plus, the US has a habit of crashing countries with interventions that often go wrong, like the endless saga in the Middle East, leaving a trail of chaos, humanitarian crises, and civilian suffering in some instances, such as in Iraq and Afghanistan. For its own benefit and interests, the US has promoted corruption, supported dissident groups, and installed leaders of its choice in other countries, making everyone question why they trusted this avenger in the first place. Now, even Western allies are biting their nails over the US's growing unreliability. They've obediently followed every US directive, from imposing sanctions to jumping into wars. And guess what? Now they're bearing the consequences of these decisions. Their economies are faltering, a predicament they had hoped Russia would face. Russia don't need to directly attack the United States or the West, with traditional military forces like guns, tanks, and planes. Instead, they engage in cyber warfare, economic warfare, espionage, and other forms of remote attacks to weaken the US over time. One such strategy is already in play. China is working to diminish the dominance of the dollar and create security for its economy, in case the US decides to impose even greater sanctions. China is pushing for the internationalization of its currency, the yuan, to reduce the dominance of the US dollar. Initiatives like currency swap agreements with other countries and efforts to conduct trade in yuan rather than dollars are part of this strategy. This diminishes the leverage of US financial systems and sanctions. Another threat is the potential impact of a new BRICS currency, often discussed but not yet realized, with experts debating its potential to challenge the dollar's dominance. But if a new BRICS currency stabilizes against the dollar, it will involve creating a common currency or a settlement system among the BRICS countries. It could weaken the power of US sanctions, leading to a further decline in the dollar's value. Psychological warfare. Russia and China could defeat the US by gaining support from sympathetic Americans, and using psychological warfare to make Americans distrust their government. For example, many Americans question their government's involvement in wars, asking, "Why do we keep doing this?" and "How can we stop?" Other concerns include rising living expenses, overlooked vulnerable populations, such as the poor and homeless, ineffective leadership, incidents of police violence, widespread racial prejudice and inequality, weak gun control, leading to regular mass shootings, pressuring and coercing allied nations, poor decision-making by those in power, high healthcare costs, and increasing rates of obesity. There is no advanced industrial democracy in the world more politically divided or dysfunctional than the United States today. The divisions within American society are leading to a breakdown of trust and stability. Russia and China are exploiting US's missteps to their advantage. So, Russia does not need to go to traditional war or nuke the US government's actions are causing enough internal turmoil on their own. Similarly, China is also not seeking traditional war. Instead, it aims to become the next superpower and control the world's economy, just as the US has done.